My name is Thomas Bell. I am 46 years old, and I work as a contracted medical courier based out of central Iowa. At the time this happened, I had been doing overnight delivery routes for a little over 8 years. The work was routine and quiet. I picked up sealed containers from hospitals, drove long stretches of highway, and dropped them at labs before sunrise. Most nights were uneventful. I preferred it that way. My regular route ran from Des Moines to several smaller towns north of Redfield. It was mostly state highways, farmland, and short gravel access roads that led to clinics and private labs. I drove the same roads at the same times every week. After a while, you stop thinking about where you are. The road becomes a pattern. That changed during the fall of 2019. Around late October, one of my drop-offs was rerouted to a smaller testing facility outside Redfield. The place sat at the end of a 2-mile county road that cut through cornfields and low tree lines. There were no houses along that stretch, just a few access gates and farm equipment parked far from the road. The first night I drove there, I noticed a pickup truck pulled over on the shoulder about half a mile before the lab. The engine was off. No hazard lights. Just sitting there in the dark. I slowed down, glanced over, and kept going. That kind of thing isn't unusual in rural Iowa. People stop to make calls or check loads. On my way back out 10 minutes later, the truck was gone. The next week, it happened again. Same road, same general spot. This time it was a different vehicle, an older sedan. Again, parked with no lights. I passed it on the way in. On the way out, it was gone. I didn't think much of it until the third week. By then, it felt deliberate. The vehicle was always there when I arrived, never when I left. Different makes, different colors. Always parked just far enough off the road that I couldn't see the driver. Always silent. I mentioned it to the lab tech one night while she signed for the delivery. She shrugged and said locals use the road sometimes. I asked if anyone lived out there. She said no, not for miles. After that, I started paying closer attention. The fourth time, I slowed down more than usual. The vehicle was a white SUV. As I passed, I noticed the driver's side window was down. There was someone inside. I could see the outline of a head facing forward. They didn't turn. They didn't move. I kept driving. On the way back, I checked my mirrors constantly. The SUV was gone. Over the next month, it became routine. Every Tuesday night, something would be parked there, sometimes a truck, sometimes a car, once a van, never the same vehicle twice, always in roughly the same spot, always gone when I returned. I started arriving earlier, thinking maybe I'd catch someone pulling in. I never did. One night in December, I arrived later than usual due to weather. Snow was falling lightly, and the road was quieter than normal. The vehicle that night was already there, a dark pickup. I slowed almost to a stop as I passed. This time, the headlights came on as I went by. They didn't follow me. They just turned on, illuminating the road behind me. I finished my drop-off and came back out within 5 minutes. The truck was still there, headlights on, engine running. I stopped my van about 20 yards back and waited. Nothing happened. After about a minute, the headlights turned off. The engine shut down. I waited another minute, then drove past. As I did, I glanced inside. The seat was empty. After that night, the vehicle stopped appearing. The lab contract ended in January. I never drove that road again. I don't know who was parking there or why it lined up so precisely with my schedule. I never reported it. Nothing illegal happened. But even now, I still think about how consistent it was and how suddenly it ended. I still run night routes. I still drive rural roads. But when I see a parked vehicle with no lights, I don't slow down anymore. My name is Michael Reynolds. I am 52 years old, and I work as a maintenance supervisor for a regional parks department in northern Oregon. I've spent most of my career dealing with remote properties, seasonal buildings, and facilities that sit and use for months at a time. I'm comfortable being alone, and I'm familiar with how places change when people aren't around. In early 2020, I was assigned temporary oversight of several ranger cabins near Mount Hood. These cabins weren't open to the public. They were used by forestry staff during peak seasons and left locked during the winter months. My responsibility was to inspect them periodically for weather damage, vandalism, or maintenance issues. One of these cabins was farther out than the others. It required parking at a service road and walking nearly half a mile through trees to reach it. The trail wasn't marked for public use, and during winter, it was usually covered in snow. I checked that cabin once a month. The first visit in January was uneventful. The door was locked. The interior was cold but intact, and nothing appeared disturbed. I logged my visit, secured the place, and left. In February, things were slightly different. When I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was a logbook. It was supposed to be kept inside a drawer built into the entry table. That's where it had always been. This time, it was sitting out on the table. It wasn't open, just placed neatly near the center. At the time, I assumed another staff member had stopped by and forgotten to put it back. That wasn't unusual, especially during staffing shortages. I put the book back in the drawer, completed my inspection, and left. In March, the logbook was out again. This time it was open. It wasn't open to a new entry. It was turned to a page from several months earlier. Nothing was written on it, just an old entry describing routine maintenance. I checked the door and windows. Everything was secure. There were no signs of forced entry, no damage, no missing items. I contacted my supervisor later that week to ask if anyone else had access to the cabin. He said no. According to their records, I was the only one assigned to it. By April, the snow around the cabin had begun to melt. The trail was muddy but passable. As I approached the clearing, I noticed footprints. They were human, boot prints, adult size. They led from the tree line directly to the cabin door. There were no vehicle tracks nearby. Whoever made them had walked in. Inside, the cabin looked the same. The logbook was on the table again. This time, it was turned to the most recent entry I had written. I stood there for a while, just looking at it. Nothing else was out of place. No trash. No sign someone had stayed. The propane tank was untouched. No food wrappers. No bedding disturbed. It didn't feel like vandalism. It felt like presence. In May, I decided to document it more carefully. I installed a small battery-powered motion sensor near the front door. It didn't record video. It just logged timestamps when movement was detected. When I returned in June, the sensor showed multiple activations. Most were late at night, between midnight and 3 in the morning, spread across several different days. The door was still locked when I arrived. Inside, the logbook was on the table again. Next to it was a pencil. The cabin didn't have writing utensils. I hadn't brought one. There were still no new entries. I reported this formally. It took time to get a response. Budget cuts were ongoing, and remote cabins weren't considered priority. I checked the cabin one final time in July. Everything was normal. The logbook was in the drawer. The sensor showed no new activity, no footprints outside. As I locked up and prepared to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the outer log near the doorframe, there were shallow markings carved into the wood, just short lines, evenly spaced. They weren't words. They didn't form symbols I recognized. They looked deliberate but subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. I didn't add them, and they hadn't been there before. Later that year, the cabin was decommissioned due to structural concerns. I never returned. I don't know who was entering it, how they were locking it behind them, or why they never took anything. I only know that someone was there repeatedly and left no trace except the fact that things were slightly different each time. My name is Daniel Harper. I am 39 years old, and I work as a regional insurance field adjuster in Western Pennsylvania. My job requires me to travel for extended periods, often staying in short-term rentals near assignment sites. I'm used to unfamiliar houses and temporary living arrangements. In December 2018, I rented a small two-bedroom house on Alder Street in a town called Mill Creek. It was an older neighborhood, quiet and mostly residential. The house was built sometime in the 1950s. It had a finished main floor, an unfinished basement, and an attached garage. I lived there alone. The first week passed without incident. I worked long hours and came home late most nights. I didn't spend much time exploring the house. The first thing that stood out was the basement light. I rarely went down there. The basement was cold and unfinished, used mainly for storage. But one evening, I came home and noticed light spilling out from under the basement door. I assumed I'd forgotten to turn it off. It happened again 2 nights later. By the third time, I was sure I hadn't been down there. I started checking the basement light every morning before leaving for work. I made a point of turning it off myself. Without fail, it would be on again when I returned. I mentioned it casually to the landlord. He said the wiring was old, that sometimes switches flipped on their own. It sounded plausible. In early January, something else started happening. I kept a small radio on my nightstand. I used it for background noise while sleeping. More than once, I woke up to find it tuned to a different station. It was never loud, always low-volume talk radio. At first, I assumed I'd rolled over and bumped it, but after it happened several times, I started turning the radio off completely before going to bed. That stopped. A week later, I noticed the basement door was unlocked when I came home. I had started locking it intentionally. I checked the rest of the house. Doors and windows were locked. Nothing appeared disturbed. No missing items. I placed a small strip of tape across the basement door frame before leaving for work the next day. When I came home that evening, the tape was broken. The door was unlocked. I didn't confront the landlord. I didn't call the police. There was no clear evidence of a crime, but the house no longer felt empty when I wasn't there. In late January, I finished my assignment early. I packed my belongings and moved out in February. The landlord seemed surprised but didn't question my decision. I never found out what was happening in that house. I never saw anyone. I never heard footsteps, but I learned to pay attention to small, repeatable changes. They tend to mean more than obvious signs ever do.